Thank you very much for coming, everyone, on this lovely sunny day. My name's Carl Emmerson. I'm Deputy Director here at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and one consequence of us postponing the event from Tuesday to today is that Paul Johnson, our Director, is not able to be here. So the format for today is I will start with some opening remarks. I will then hand over to Robert Joyce, who's going to talk you through the tax and benefit plans of the main parties' proposals. We'll then have Rowena Crawford, who will talk about public service spending under each of the main parties. And then finally, and probably least, you will then have me talking about what our take is for what all means for the fiscal aggregates under Labour and the Conservative plans. So what would the outlook for taxes, spending, and the borrowing and debt be? Before I start, I'd like to thank the Nuffield Foundation, who very swiftly provided funding that enabled us to do all of the analysis that we've been doing on the election over the last few weeks. And I'd also like to thank a whole set of colleagues at the IFS who've made all of this analysis possible. What we're presenting here today is not just the work of us three. And with that in mind, we have a few of them sat on the front row to answer any particularly difficult questions that you might have. Okay, so you don't need the IFS to tell you that there are big differences between the Labour and the Conservative manifestos. Labour would raise spending to its highest level since the mid-1980s and tax to record levels in peacetime. The Conservatives would preside over yet more spending cuts alongside a modest increase in the tax burden. Labour have said that they would increase capital spending dramatically and would accept a much bigger budget deficit than would the Conservatives. So that's the big story, and actually that seems to be close to what each wants you to hear. But as ever, there is rather more to it than that. What Labour actually want you to hear is that the spending increases they propose are pretty much across the board on higher education, childcare, schools, health, welfare and the rest, and they would be funded by tax increases that solely affect the rich and companies. This would not happen. They've supposedly identified £49 billion worth of tax increases. That is an overestimate. They certainly shouldn't plan on their tax raises increasing revenues by more than £40 billion in the short run, and it's more likely than not that they would raise less than that. And they would certainly raise less, considerably less in the longer term. And the big increases in corporation tax that they propose would still make a broad group of people worse off, just as surely as an increase in VAT or an increase in the standard rates of income tax, as the Liberal Democrats propose, would. When businesses pay tax, they're handing over money that would otherwise have ended up with people, and not only rich ones. Millions with pension funds are effectively shareholders, and in the longer term, much of the cost is likely to be passed on to workers through lower wages or to consumers through higher prices. Now, that isn't to say we should not tax businesses, but we shouldn't pretend that it's somehow victimless and hence fundamentally different from personal taxation. It's just that the impacts on households are less transparent. What would Labour do in the event that revenues did not come in as planned? Well, that's unclear. Would they raise other taxes, or would they spend less, or would they borrow more? Now, there is a case to be made for a bigger state. Labour's proposals would not take tax and spending to unusually high levels amongst advanced economies. You're talking about around Canadian rather than Scandinavian levels. But the case does need to be made honestly about what it would mean for tax payments, not by pretending that everything can be paid for by someone else. If they were to embark on this set of spending increases, some increases in taxes, other than those mentioned in the manifesto, would look likely. A state of the size that Labour Party would like would require broad-based tax increases. The Conservative manifesto, by contrast, appears to be selling a steady-as-she-goes prospectus. But that does not mean no change from today, because the Conservatives in government have already laid down big policy plans. It means big cuts in welfare. It means another parliament of austerity for the public services, including an incredibly challenging period for the NHS and real cuts to per-pupil funding in schools. And it is not clear that these plans would be deliverable. Barely 2 months after the 2015 general election, the Conservatives announced spending plans that were less tight than the ones that they'd set out in their manifesto. Maybe they'd do that again. I would also not bet against the Conservative government finding some additional tax-raising measures. So what about the challenges over the longer term? Well, a surge in investment spending, as proposed by Labour, should, if well spent, have positive long-term economic returns. But you've got to remember that the Conservative government had in any case committed to some quite significant increases in investment spending. So ramping up more quickly does risk waste. On the other side of the ledger, big increases in corporation taxes risk significant falls in private sector investment. and that might compound the risks to investment that are associated with Brexit. Labour also proposed a higher minimum wage set at a higher level relative to average earnings than any other comparable country other than France, and at such a high level that it would set the pay of more than a quarter of private sector workers and 60% of those aged under 25. That latter element in particular looks like it could have the potential for imposing significant social and economic costs, risking the employment opportunities of many young people. We simply do not know beyond what level a higher minimum wage would start to have serious impacts on employment. It follows that sudden, large increases represent a gamble. The Conservatives, meanwhile, propose a more modest, though still substantial increase in the minimum wage, and like Labour are abandoning the old model, where the minimum was increased incrementally each year while an independent expert body meticulously checked at each stage whether it was having harmful effects on employment. The Conservatives' continued focus on reducing immigration would, if effective, cause considerable economic damage and create additional problems for the public finances. The OBR has already downgraded its forecast for receipts by £6 billion at the end of this decade and rising thereafter due to lower expected net immigration. Meeting the Conservatives' commitment to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands would hit tax revenues by a similar amount again. That additional public finance challenge is especially pertinent in the context of an ageing population, which will push up pressures on health, pensions and social care over coming decades. On fairly conservative estimates, these pressures could exceed 5% of national income, or £100 billion in current terms, by the middle of this century. Denying entry to young working immigrants would make that challenge all the harder to meet. But so would continuing the triple lock on the state pension as Labour propose, or the very similar double lock as the Conservatives propose. Arguably, the Conservatives are at least attempting a nod towards dealing with the costs of an ageing population, with the means testing of winter fuel payments alongside this tweak to the triple lock. But in practice, this would make a wholly trivial difference to spending. Their proposals on social care have been, shall we say, in flux. The original proposals would have been more generous to those in residential care and less generous to those receiving care at home. It now looks like a cap on costs will be introduced, presumably at some cost to public spending. But surely a green paper, followed by a consultation, as the Chancellor set out in the March budget, would be a better way to make policy than Monday's U-turn on the proposed change in direction that was announced the previous Thursday. Labour, by contrast, would do nothing at all to limit spending on pensioner benefits. Not only would they keep the triple lock and all the current benefits, they've even suggested fixing the state pension age at 66, rather than increasing it in line with longevity. Male life expectancy at 65 has risen from 13 years to 18 years since the start of the 1980s. That's a 40% increase, and it will rise further. Failing to increase the state pension age would increase spending by more than £30 billion a year by the middle of this century, relative to current plans. It's hard to see the merit in such a proposition. One of the striking things about Labour's spending commitments is the extent to which they extend the risk of public provision rather than focusing on reversing cuts. Taking the manifesto at face value, the vast majority of the proposed cuts to working age benefits would stand. That's in sharp contrast to the Liberal Democrat manifesto. Labour's proposed increases in health funding are modest. Spending would still rise at barely half its long-term average, following the tightest 7 years in the NHS's history. Many of the deep cuts seen elsewhere, it would seem, would remain. The two big areas of spending which Labour would increase are childcare and higher education. The former is costed by over £5 billion a year, a 70% increase on current spending levels, and that is almost certainly an underestimate, at least over the longer term. That said, their proposals would sweep away a complex array of subsidies in favour of a relatively straightforward universal provision, and that would arguably be the logical conclusion of a long-term journey that the state has been making. Proposals to make higher education free would instead be a reversal of policy pursued by all governments in the last 2 decades. Abolishing tuition fees for higher education is the most expensive pledge in the Labour manifesto, and is a policy that benefits the most successful of the generally better off section of the population which attends university. It might also constrain growth in higher education sector, as expanding the number of places available would become much more expensive for government. From the Conservatives, we have little or nothing. Compared to a typical budget, their manifesto is extremely light on tax and spending proposals. The promised £8 billion increase in NHS funding is essentially consistent with the March budget. as planned over the next couple of years, and then stable as a share of national income thereafter. Given the scale of pressure the NHS is already under, there must be serious doubts to the deliverability of such tight spending plans. As with the NHS, Labour promises to spend more on schools than do the Conservatives, who promise little more than that implied by the March budget. The big question regarding the deliverability of Conservative spending plans is well illustrated by the choice over public sector pay. Continuing with a 1% cap for the next 2 years would take pay levels in the public sector to easily their lowest level relative to the private sector in recent decades, with problems of recruitment, retention and morale all possible outcomes. Labour's plans, by contrast, imply public sector employers facing a £9 billion a year increase in their employment costs. So what would this mean for the public finances? Even taking an optimistic view on tax receipts, Labour would run a substantially bigger deficit than the Conservatives, to the tune of £37 billion more in 21-22 on our calculations. Now that number should be taken as purely illustrative, given all of the uncertainties involved, both over policy and over the economy. It rather optimistically assumes Labour's measures would raise £41 billion extra in tax. At total borrowing of around £58 billion, that would still leave Labour with plenty of headroom against their fiscal target of achieving balance on the current budget. They might find it harder to meet their second target of getting debt down as a fraction of national income. If it does fall, it won't fall by much. With debt approaching 90% of national income, there may be some risk with a set of policies which do not result in its level turning decisively downwards. For the Conservatives, the aim of an overall budget balance remains, but not until the mid-2020s, beyond the end of the coming Parliament. Now that provides flexibility with regard relative to an earlier date, but it remains a much tighter ambition than Labour's. On manifesto plans, the deficit could still be around 1% of national income by 21-22, or around £21 billion, potentially leading to a fourth Parliament of austerity after that. The shame of the two big parties' manifestos is that neither sets out an honest set of choices. Neither addresses the long-run challenges we face. For Labour, we can have pretty much everything: free HE, free childcare, more spending on pay, health, infrastructure. And the pretense is it can all be funded by faceless corporations and the rich. Now, there is a choice we can make as a country to have a bigger state, one that would not make us unusual in international terms. But that comes at a cost in higher taxes, which would inevitably need to be borne by a large number of us. Labour are not merely asking for a bit more from the top 5% while leaving ordinary households alone. There is no way that tens of billions of pounds of tax rises they promise would be borne entirely by such a small group, if only policy making was so easy. The Conservatives simply offer the cuts that have already been promised. Additional funding pledges for the NHS and schools are just confirming that spending would rise in a way that's broadly consistent with the March budget. Compared with Labour, they're offering a relatively smaller state and consequently lower taxes. With that choice come unacknowledged risks to the quality of public services and tough choices over spending. The difficulty in making some of these choices has been well exemplified by the toing and froing, to put it politely, over the funding of social care. The Labour manifesto would come with two big risks. The first is they might well not raise anything like the tax revenues they want from their proposed measures. The second is that some of the proposed tax increases, alongside the very big increases in the minimum wage and other labour market regulation, will turn out to be economically damaging. For Conservatives, the big risk is that after 7 years of austerity, they would not be able to deliver the promised spending cuts, either at all, or at least not without serious damage to the quality of our public services. Their tight immigration targets, in addition, would, if they actually delivered them, also damage the economy and the tax base. I will now hand over to Rob, who will take you through the tax and benefit plans.